Nobody believed a 52-year-old maintenance contractor with arthritis in his hands could resurrect a dead Apache helicopter when the Army's top mechanics had declared it unfixable. Most saw Bobby Martinez as the old-timer who shuffled around Hangar 7 with outdated tools and yesterday's techniques. But when 3 wounded soldiers lay bleeding in hostile territory with a closing weather window and every other aircraft grounded, his forgotten mastery of helicopter hydraulics and 30 years of improvised field repairs would prove that sometimes the oldest hands know secrets that computer diagnostics never learned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Colorado morning air at Fort Carson carried the sharp bite of altitude and the metallic tang of aviation fuel that permeated everything within a quarter mile of the flight line. Hangar 7 stretched across the tarmac like a steel cathedral, its massive doors permanently rolled back to accommodate the sleek, predatory forms of Apache AH-64E, Guardian helicopters that represented the cutting edge of military aviation technology. The facility hummed with constant activity as crews performed the intricate dance of maintenance, inspection, and preparation that kept these sophisticated war machines airworthy and mission-ready around the clock. Inside the cavernous space, banks of diagnostic computers lined the walls, their screens displaying cascading streams of data that monitored every conceivable system parameter on the aircraft. The air conditioning struggled against the Colorado heat while industrial-grade ventilation systems worked overtime to clear the constant haze of hydraulic fluid vapors, cleaning solvents, and the ozone smell of high-voltage electrical systems being tested and retested by technicians whose training cost the Army hundreds of thousands of dollars per person. Bobby Martinez entered through the personnel door at exactly 0630 hours, just as he had every weekday for the past 8 years since accepting his civilian contractor position. His gait carried the deliberate pace of someone whose lower back reminded him daily of 3 decades spent crawling through aircraft engine compartments and lying on concrete floors beneath multi-million-dollar helicopters. At 52, his weathered hands showed the permanent stains and small scars that marked a lifetime of mechanical work, while his graying hair and lined face made him appear older than his years among the predominantly young military personnel who comprised most of the hangar's workforce. His civilian contractor badge hung from a retractable cord that had seen better days, and his navy blue uniform shirt bore the faded logo of Aerospace Maintenance Solutions, the private company that had won the bid for providing supplemental technical support to the base's aviation operations. Bobby's tool bag, slung over his shoulder like a well-worn leather satchel, contained an eclectic mix of standard military issue equipment and personal tools that he'd accumulated over decades of solving problems that official manuals never anticipated. The bag itself was a testament to longevity, its canvas exterior patched and repatched but still functional after years of daily use. The morning shift change was already in progress as Bobby made his way toward his assigned work area near the rear of the hangar. Staff Sergeant Mike Davidson, the lead military mechanic whose crisp uniform and confident bearing marked him as someone destined for leadership roles, was conducting the daily briefing with his team of specialists. Their conversation carried easily across the concrete floor, mixing technical jargon with the casual profanity that characterized military mechanical discussions worldwide. What most of the younger technicians didn't realize was that Bobby's seemingly outdated approach to helicopter maintenance stemmed from experience with aircraft systems that predated computer diagnostics by decades. His military service had begun when helicopter mechanics diagnosed problems by listening to engine harmonics, feeling vibration patterns through airframe structures, and using manual testing procedures that required intimate knowledge of how complex mechanical systems actually functioned rather than simply following computer-generated troubleshooting flowcharts. Bobby's workstation occupied a corner area that younger mechanics considered less desirable because it lacked direct access to the sophisticated diagnostic equipment that had become standard for modern aircraft maintenance. His bench held an assortment of gauges, measuring devices, and hand tools that looked primitive compared to the computerized systems that dominated contemporary maintenance procedures. However, his setup also included several pieces of test equipment that he'd maintained and calibrated himself. Devices that could measure hydraulic pressures, electrical continuity, and mechanical tolerances with precision that often exceeded the capabilities of newer automated systems. The first indication that this particular Tuesday would be different from routine maintenance operations came at 0847 hours when the base communication system crackled to life with an urgent message from Regional Command. Captain Jessica Thompson, the flight operations officer, immediately summoned all available maintenance personnel to an emergency briefing that would determine whether Fort Carson could respond to a developing crisis situation in the field. 3 soldiers from an advanced reconnaissance patrol had been seriously wounded during a firefight with insurgent forces in a remote valley approximately 120 kilometers northeast of the base. The terrain and tactical situation made ground evacuation impossible, while the nearest alternative medical facilities lacked the surgical capabilities necessary to save lives that hung in the balance with each passing minute. The wounded soldiers required immediate helicopter evacuation to the base's trauma center, where military surgeons waited with equipment and expertise that could mean the difference between survival and casualty statistics. The mission planning revealed complications that transformed a routine medical evacuation into a complex operational challenge. Weather reconnaissance indicated that a severe storm system was approaching from the west, bringing winds and visibility conditions that would make helicopter operations impossible within approximately 90 minutes. The narrow window for safe flight operations meant that any aircraft assigned to the mission would need to launch, complete the evacuation, and return to base before deteriorating conditions grounded all aviation assets for the remainder of the day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Thompson's briefing outlined additional constraints that further complicated the situation. The standard medical evacuation helicopters were currently committed to a scheduled training exercise that couldn't be recalled in time to meet the operational deadline. The base's backup aircraft were undergoing routine maintenance procedures that left them temporarily non-operational, while other available helicopters lacked the specific medical equipment necessary for treating seriously wounded personnel during flight operations. This left only the Apache helicopters as potential platforms for the evacuation mission, despite the fact that these attack aircraft weren't designed or typically configured for medical transport operations. The modification process would require removing weapons systems and installing temporary medical equipment that could sustain wounded personnel during flight, a complex procedure that would normally require several hours of careful work by specialized technicians. The most promising candidate for rapid modification was Apache tail number 0703847, a newer Guardian variant that had recently completed major maintenance and was scheduled for routine systems testing. The aircraft's maintenance logs showed excellent operational history, while its advanced avionics and flight systems made it ideal for navigating the challenging weather conditions that were expected during the mission timeframe. However, when Specialist Kevin Walsh began the pre-modification inspection of the designated Apache, his diagnostic equipment immediately detected anomalies in the primary hydraulic system that controlled critical flight functions, including rotor, blade pitch, landing gear operation, and weapons system articulation. The computer-generated fault codes indicated multiple pressure irregularities and system response delays that fell outside acceptable operational parameters, effectively grounding the aircraft until the problems could be identified and corrected. Walsh's troubleshooting efforts using standard diagnostic procedures failed to isolate the source of the hydraulic anomalies. The computerized systems provided conflicting data that suggested problems in multiple areas simultaneously, a pattern that didn't match any scenarios covered in technical manuals or training programs. Each diagnostic sequence produced different fault codes, making systematic troubleshooting impossible using conventional approaches that relied on electronic systems to identify specific component failures. Staff Sergeant Davidson joined the troubleshooting effort, bringing additional expertise and access to more sophisticated diagnostic equipment. His attempts to isolate the hydraulic problems using advanced computer analysis produced similarly confusing results, with system parameters that fluctuated unpredictably and fault codes that appeared and disappeared without apparent correlation to any specific maintenance actions. The situation became increasingly urgent as time constraints imposed by the approaching weather system and the medical condition of the wounded soldiers created pressure for immediate solutions. Captain Thompson found herself facing an impossible choice between launching an aircraft with known maintenance issues, which violated safety protocols and risked additional casualties, or abandoning the evacuation mission and accepting responsibility for preventable deaths in the field. Bobby had been observing the troubleshooting efforts from his workstation, while continuing his assigned maintenance tasks on other aircraft. His experience with hydraulic systems that predated computer diagnostics allowed him to recognize symptoms that the electronic troubleshooting procedures were missing entirely. The pattern of intermittent pressure fluctuations and inconsistent system responses suggested problems that wouldn't appear in computer databases because they involved mechanical issues that electronic sensors couldn't directly detect. During a brief lull in the frantic troubleshooting activity, Bobby approached Specialist Walsh with a suggestion that initially drew skeptical responses from the younger technicians. His recommendation involved manual testing procedures that bypassed electronic diagnostic systems entirely, using direct pressure measurements and mechanical inspection techniques that had been standard practice before computerized troubleshooting became the norm for aircraft maintenance operations. Walsh's initial reaction reflected the generational divide that separated traditional mechanical approaches from contemporary computer-based maintenance procedures. His training emphasized following diagnostic flowcharts and trusting electronic systems to identify problems, while Bobby's suggestion involved manual techniques that seemed primitive compared to sophisticated automated testing equipment. Staff Sergeant Davidson overheard the discussion and intervened with barely concealed irritation at what he perceived as interference from civilian personnel who lacked current certification on advanced Apache systems. His response revealed assumptions about the relative value of traditional mechanical experience versus modern technical training, dismissing Bobby's suggestions as outdated approaches that had been superseded by superior electronic diagnostic capabilities. The dismissal stung, but Bobby had experienced similar reactions countless times during his 8 years as a civilian contractor. Younger military personnel often viewed his manual testing techniques as evidence of inability to adapt to modern technology, rather than recognition of fundamental mechanical principles that remain valid regardless of how sophisticated electronic systems became. Captain Thompson, facing mounting pressure as weather conditions continued deteriorating and the medical situation in the field became increasingly critical, made the difficult decision to declare the Apache unsuitable for the evacuation mission. Her announcement meant that 3 wounded soldiers would likely die because available aircraft couldn't be prepared for flight operations within the narrow window imposed by approaching weather conditions. Bobby understood the implications of the decision and realized that his decades of experience with aircraft hydraulic systems might represent the only remaining option for saving lives that hung in the balance. His knowledge of Apache hydraulic architecture, gained through years of working on earlier variants and maintaining detailed personal notes on system modifications, had revealed potential solutions that computer-based diagnostic procedures couldn't identify because they involved mechanical relationships rather than electronic parameters. The weather reporting station confirmed that storm conditions were now less than 70 minutes away, while reports from the field indicated that the wounded soldier's conditions were deteriorating rapidly without immediate medical intervention. Time was running out for any solution that could enable the critical evacuation mission. Bobby made the decision to approach Captain Thompson directly with his assessment of the hydraulic problems and a proposed solution that could restore the Apache to operational status within the remaining time constraints. His approach required courage because it meant contradicting the conclusions of military specialists whose authority and expertise were officially recognized, while his own recommendations would be based on manual inspection techniques that official procedures no longer emphasized. Captain Thompson's response to Bobby's intervention would determine whether traditional mechanical expertise could contribute to solving a crisis that electronic diagnostic systems had failed to address. The fate of 3 wounded soldiers depended on whether military command structure could recognize the value of experience that didn't appear in computer databases but had been proven through decades of practical application under field conditions. The hangar fell silent as Bobby approached the group of military personnel who had been struggling with the diagnostic mystery for nearly an hour. His civilian contractor status made him an outsider in the military hierarchy, while his age and traditional approach to maintenance marked him as someone whose methods belonged to an earlier era of aircraft technology. However, the urgency of the situation and the failure of conventional approaches had created an opening for unconventional solutions. Bobby's next words would either establish his credibility as someone whose expertise could contribute to the mission's success, or confirm the assumptions of younger personnel who viewed his traditional techniques as irrelevant to contemporary aviation maintenance challenges. The wounded soldiers waiting for evacuation had no way of knowing that their survival might depend on whether arthritis-stained hands and outdated tools could accomplish what sophisticated computer systems and modern diagnostic equipment had failed to achieve. The storm clouds building on the western horizon served as a visible reminder that time was running out for any solution, while the urgent radio communications from the field painted an increasingly desperate picture of medical conditions that required immediate intervention. Bobby's decades of experience had led him to this moment where traditional mechanical knowledge would either prove its continued relevance or be dismissed as inadequate for addressing contemporary aviation challenges. The silence stretched as military personnel waited to hear what the old civilian contractor believed he could contribute to a situation that had stumped their most advanced diagnostic capabilities. Captain Thompson's expression shifted from professional courtesy to guarded skepticism as Bobby stepped forward from the periphery of the maintenance group. The assembled military personnel turned to regard him with varying degrees of curiosity and dismissal, their body language reflecting the natural hierarchy that placed active duty specialists above civilian contractors in matters of technical authority. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across Bobby's weathered features, emphasizing the lines around his eyes and the gray stubble that marked him as someone from a different generation than the predominantly young technicians who comprised the base's aviation maintenance workforce. Staff Sergeant Davidson's posture stiffened visibly as he recognized the interruption as coming from someone outside the direct military chain of command. His training emphasized proper protocols and established procedures, making Bobby's civilian status an immediate complication in what was already a high-pressure situation, requiring rapid decision-making and coordinated action. The sergeant's expression conveyed polite tolerance mixed with barely concealed impatience at what he perceived as interference from support personnel, who lacked current certification on the sophisticated systems they were attempting to repair. Specialist Walsh paused his diagnostic computer operations and looked up from the array of screens, displaying cascading fault codes and system parameters that had been providing contradictory information for the past hour. His youth and recent technical training made him particularly dependent on electronic diagnostic systems, creating natural skepticism toward suggestions that involved manual testing procedures he'd never learned to trust or properly execute under field conditions. Bobby understood the dynamics at play and had experienced similar reactions countless times during his tenure as a civilian contractor working alongside military personnel who viewed his traditional approaches as evidence of technological obsolescence rather than accumulated wisdom. His response needed to demonstrate competence without appearing to challenge military authority, while providing sufficient technical detail to establish credibility among specialists who had been trained to trust computer systems above human intuition. The ambient noise of the hangar provided a constant backdrop of mechanical sounds, ventilation systems, and distant radio communications that created an atmosphere of urgent activity while Bobby formulated his approach to the group of increasingly frustrated military technicians. His tool bag felt heavier than usual as he shifted it to a more comfortable position, the familiar weight of instruments and devices that had served him through decades of solving problems that sophisticated diagnostic equipment couldn't address effectively. Captain Thompson's training as a flight operations officer included responsibility for making decisions that balanced technical constraints against mission requirements, often under time pressure that didn't allow for extensive consultation or analysis. Her expression indicated willingness to consider input from any source that might contribute to mission success, while remaining mindful of the protocol requirements that governed interactions between military personnel and civilian contractors during operational situations. The storm system visible through the hangar's open doors served as a constant reminder that weather conditions were continuing to deteriorate according to meteorological predictions that had proven accurate throughout the morning. The visual evidence of approaching clouds and increasing wind activity reinforced the urgency of finding solutions that could enable aircraft operations before atmospheric conditions made flight operations impossible for the remainder of the day. Bobby's decades of experience had taught him that successful communication with military personnel required demonstrating respect for their expertise, while contributing information that enhanced rather than contradicted their professional knowledge. His approach involved acknowledging the sophistication of their diagnostic efforts, while offering insights based on mechanical principles that predated electronic systems but remained fundamental to aircraft hydraulic operation under all conditions. The first words he spoke carried the measured tone of someone who understood that credibility needed to be established through demonstrated knowledge rather than claimed authority. His voice reflected the gravelly quality that came from years of working in environments filled with aircraft engines, industrial machinery, and the constant background noise that characterized aviation maintenance facilities throughout his military and civilian career. Bobby began by describing what he had observed during the diagnostic procedures, acknowledging the thoroughness of the electronic testing while noting patterns in the fault codes that suggested mechanical issues that wouldn't register properly on computer systems designed to monitor electronic parameters rather than physical component relationships. His analysis drew from experience with hydraulic systems that had been manually diagnosed and repaired before computerized troubleshooting became standard practice in military aviation maintenance. The younger technicians exchanged glances that reflected their uncertainty about how to respond to suggestions that involved bypassing the electronic diagnostic procedures they had been trained to trust above all other sources of technical information. Their education emphasized following established protocols and relying on computer-generated data rather than subjective observations or manual testing techniques that seemed primitive compared to sophisticated automated systems. Staff Sergeant Davidson's initial response revealed the institutional bias toward modernization that characterized contemporary military technical training. His questions about Bobby's current certification status and familiarity with Guardian variant Apache systems reflected legitimate concerns about maintaining proper technical standards, while also suggesting skepticism about the relevance of experience gained on earlier aircraft configurations. Bobby anticipated these concerns and responded by acknowledging the technological advances that distinguished current Apache variants from the aircraft he had worked on during his military service, while explaining how fundamental hydraulic principles remained consistent across all helicopter designs, regardless of electronic enhancements or computer-controlled monitoring systems. His explanation included specific technical details about pressure relationships and component interactions that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of aircraft hydraulic architecture. The discussion attracted attention from other maintenance personnel working in adjacent areas of the hangar, creating an impromptu audience of military and civilian technicians who paused their own activities to observe the developing interaction between traditional mechanical expertise and contemporary diagnostic approaches. Their presence added social pressure to the situation, while providing additional perspectives on the relative merits of different troubleshooting methodologies. Specialist Walsh's computer screens continued displaying the confusing array of fault codes that had been appearing and disappearing without apparent correlation to any specific maintenance actions or component testing. The electronic diagnostic system's inability to provide consistent or useful information created an opening for alternative approaches, while the time constraints imposed by weather conditions and medical emergencies made experimental troubleshooting a luxury that the situation couldn't afford. Bobby's tool bag contained several instruments that could provide direct measurements of hydraulic system parameters without relying on the aircraft's electronic monitoring systems. His pressure gauges, flow meters, and mechanical testing devices represented technology that was considered obsolete by contemporary standards, but offered the advantage of measuring actual physical conditions rather than electronic interpretations of sensor data that might be influenced by factors the computer systems couldn't properly evaluate. Captain Thompson found herself weighing the potential benefits of unconventional diagnostic approaches against the risks of deviating from established maintenance protocols during a high-stakes mission preparation. Her responsibility for operational success made her willing to consider any option that might restore aircraft availability, while her understanding of military regulations made her cautious about authorizing procedures that weren't covered by official technical manuals or standard operating procedures. The hangar's public address system crackled with updated weather information that confirmed the approaching storm system was maintaining its predicted timeline and intensity. The meteorological report added urgency to the decision-making process, while reinforcing the narrow window available for completing aircraft preparation and launching the medical evacuation mission before atmospheric conditions made flight operations impossible. Bobby's proposal involved a systematic manual inspection of the Apache's hydraulic system using direct pressure measurements and mechanical component testing that could identify problems invisible to electronic diagnostic procedures. His approach required approximately 30 minutes to complete, matching exactly the time constraint that had been established for the entire repair process, but offered the potential to identify and correct issues that computer systems had failed to isolate. Despite extensive testing, the silence that followed, Bobby's technical explanation stretched for several seconds as the assembled military personnel processed the implications of authorizing diagnostic procedures that fell outside their standard training and certification requirements. Their decision would determine whether traditional mechanical expertise could contribute to solving a crisis that sophisticated electronic systems had failed to address through conventional troubleshooting approaches. Staff Sergeant Davidson's expression reflected the internal conflict between following established protocols and accepting responsibility for mission failure due to adherence to procedures that weren't producing results. His leadership position required balancing technical standards against operational necessities, while considering the potential consequences of both action and inaction under circumstances that official training had never specifically addressed. The distant sound of radio communications from the Tactical Operations Center provided occasional updates on the condition of wounded soldiers awaiting evacuation, adding human urgency to the technical challenges facing the maintenance team. Each transmission reinforced the life and death implications of the decisions being made in Hangar 7, while time continued passing toward the weather deadline that would eliminate all remaining options for mission completion. Bobby's weathered hands showed slight tremors that he attributed to the arthritis that had developed during decades of manual labor, but his voice remained steady as he outlined the specific testing procedures he proposed to implement. His confidence, derived from experience with similar diagnostic challenges that had required improvised solutions under field conditions where electronic systems provided inadequate information for effective troubleshooting. The fluorescent lighting reflected off the polished surfaces of the Apache's airframe, creating highlights and shadows that emphasized the aircraft's sophisticated design, while reminding everyone present of the complexity involved in maintaining systems that represented millions of dollars in advanced technology. The visual contrast between the helicopter's modern appearance and Bobby's traditional diagnostic tools symbolized the generational and technological differences that were influencing the current decision-making process. Captain Thompson's training included exposure to historical cases where unconventional approaches had produced successful outcomes during crisis situations, providing context for evaluating Bobby's proposal against the risk of continuing with diagnostic procedures that had already proven ineffective. Her analysis needed to consider not only the technical merits of different approaches, but also the leadership implications of authorizing actions that deviated from standard military protocols. The assembled group of maintenance personnel represented a cross-section of military aviation technical expertise, from recently graduated specialists to experienced non-commissioned officers who had worked on various aircraft types throughout their careers. Their collective knowledge provided a resource for evaluating Bobby's suggestions, while their diverse perspectives offered different viewpoints on the relative merits of traditional versus contemporary diagnostic approaches. Bobby's explanation included specific details about hydraulic component relationships and pressure dynamics that demonstrated deep understanding of aircraft systems engineering, gradually establishing his credibility among military personnel, who had initially viewed him as someone whose expertise belonged to an earlier era of aviation technology. His technical vocabulary and precise descriptions of component interactions revealed knowledge that couldn't be easily dismissed despite his civilian contractor status. The storm clouds visible through the hangar doors had grown noticeably darker during the extended diagnostic discussions, providing visual confirmation of meteorological predictions, while adding urgency to decision-making processes that would determine whether the evacuation mission could proceed. The approaching weather represented an inflexible deadline that would eliminate all options if aircraft preparation couldn't be completed within the remaining time constraints. Specialist Walsh's computer system chimed with another series of fault codes that appeared different from previous diagnostic results, but equally unhelpful, for identifying specific component failures or maintenance actions that might restore the aircraft to operational status. The electronic diagnostic equipment's continued inability to provide useful guidance created mounting frustration among military technicians whose training emphasized trust in computer systems above alternative troubleshooting methods. Bobby's proposal represented a calculated risk that weighed the potential for success, using traditional diagnostic techniques against the certainty of mission failure if current approaches continued producing ineffective results. His confidence in manual testing procedures derived from decades of experience solving similar problems when electronic systems were unavailable or unreliable, providing perspective on aircraft maintenance challenges that contemporary military training didn't emphasize. The hangar's ventilation systems worked to clear the accumulating haze of hydraulic fluid vapors and cleaning solvents that characterized aerospace maintenance environments, creating air currents that carried the distinctive chemical scents associated with sophisticated aircraft systems. The industrial atmosphere reinforced the high-technology nature of the equipment being serviced, while highlighting the contrast between modern maintenance facilities and the traditional tools that Bobby proposed to use for diagnostic purposes. Captain Thompson's decision-making process involved weighing multiple factors including technical feasibility, PROTOCOL compliance, mission requirements, and time constraints that created a complex situation without clear precedents in military regulations or training materials. Her choice would determine whether the evacuation mission could proceed and would establish her reputation for leadership under pressure, while potentially affecting the lives of wounded soldiers awaiting medical assistance. The radio communications from the field continued providing updates that painted an increasingly urgent picture of medical conditions that required immediate helicopter evacuation to prevent casualties that could have been avoided with timely intervention. Each transmission added emotional weight to the technical discussions taking place in Hangar 7 while reinforcing the human consequences of the maintenance decisions being considered by military personnel and civilian contractors. Bobby's arthritis stiffened. Fingers adjusted the straps on his tool bag as he prepared to demonstrate the manual diagnostic procedures he had proposed, understanding that his next actions would either validate decades of mechanical experience or confirm the assumptions of younger personnel who viewed traditional techniques as inadequate for contemporary aviation maintenance challenges. His movement toward the Apache signaled readiness to begin the testing process that could determine whether the evacuation mission would proceed or be abandoned due to aircraft unavailability. The assembled military personnel faced a decision that would test their willingness to trust unconventional approaches when established procedures had failed to produce results, while time constraints eliminated the possibility of extensive deliberation or consultation with higher authority. Their choice would determine whether traditional mechanical expertise could contribute to mission success or would be rejected in favor of continued reliance on diagnostic procedures that had already proven ineffective under current circumstances. Staff Sergeant Davidson's expression reflected the weight of responsibility for authorizing maintenance procedures that fell outside standard protocols while accepting accountability for the consequences of either action or inaction during a crisis situation that official training had never specifically addressed. His decision would influence not only the immediate mission outcome, but also establish precedents for future interactions between military authority and civilian technical expertise during emergency situations. The silence in Hangar 7 stretched as multiple factors converged toward a decision point that would determine whether Bobby's traditional diagnostic approach would be authorized or whether the evacuation mission would be abandoned due to aircraft maintenance issues that sophisticated electronic systems had failed to resolve through conventional troubleshooting procedures. The outcome would affect wounded soldiers, military personnel, and civilian contractors whose different perspectives on technical problem-solving had created the current situation requiring immediate resolution. The break room buzzed with conversation. During the afternoon shift change, as maintenance personnel gathered around coffee dispensers and snack machines that had become informal centers of social interaction throughout the hangar complex, Bobby entered the space carrying his lunch tray, scanning the room for an empty seat while the various groups of military personnel continued their discussions about aircraft status, upcoming inspections, and the technical challenges that characterized daily operations at Fort Carson. Specialist Walsh looked up from his sandwich as Bobby approached an adjacent table, nudging Sergeant Lisa Chun with his elbow before speaking loud enough to ensure his comments carried across the immediate area. "Look who's here," the Apache whisperer himself. "I bet Bobby thinks he can diagnose helicopter problems just by listening to the engine hum from across the hangar." Chun laughed while shaking her head in apparent disbelief. "I heard he carries around pressure gauges that look like they belong in a museum. What's he planning to do? Check hydraulic pressure with instruments that probably haven't been calibrated since the Clinton administration?" Their conversation attracted attention from other personnel seated nearby, creating an audience for comments that reflected the generational divide between traditional mechanical approaches and contemporary, computer-based diagnostic procedures. The social dynamics of the break room amplified individual opinions into collective judgments about the relative value of different technical methodologies and professional backgrounds. Staff Sergeant Davidson joined the discussion as he settled into a chair with his coffee, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose leadership position made his opinions influential among subordinate personnel. "Bobby's been working around helicopters since before most of you were born, but that doesn't mean his old-school techniques are relevant to Guardian variant Apaches. These aircraft have integrated systems that require electronic diagnostic capabilities he's never been trained to understand properly." The criticism stung because it contained elements of truth mixed with assumptions that reflected institutional bias toward modernization and technological advancement. Bobby's certification records did show gaps in training on the most recent Apache variants, while his preference for manual testing procedures appeared outdated compared to sophisticated computer systems that could monitor hundreds of parameters simultaneously during diagnostic operations. Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez, a young avionics technician whose recent graduation from technical school made him particularly dependent on electronic diagnostic procedures, added his perspective to the developing conversation. "I don't understand why they keep civilian contractors around who can't adapt to current technology. Bobby probably thinks he can fix complex hydraulic problems with a wrench and some intuition." The laughter that followed Rodriguez's comment created an atmosphere of casual dismissal that characterized many interactions between military personnel and civilian contractors whose backgrounds didn't align with contemporary training standards. Bobby continued eating his lunch while listening to conversations that revealed more about the speaker's insecurities than about his actual capabilities or technical knowledge. Chief Warrant Officer James Patterson, whose pilot experience included thousands of flight hours in various Apache configurations, offered a different perspective that acknowledged both technological progress and the value of institutional memory. Bobby worked on helicopters when mechanics had to understand every component relationship, because diagnostic computers weren't available to tell them where to look for problems. That kind of background creates troubleshooting instincts that can be valuable when electronic systems provide conflicting information. Patterson's comments produced a brief silence as younger personnel processed the implications of his observation. But the social momentum of dismissive attitudes quickly reasserted itself through continued speculation about Bobby's relevance to contemporary maintenance operations. The pilot's reputation commanded respect, but his defense of traditional approaches conflicted with prevailing opinions about technological superiority that characterize most technical discussions among maintenance staff. Specialist Walsh resumed the conversation with renewed confidence, his voice carrying the certainty of someone whose recent training made him feel qualified to judge approaches he'd never learned to execute properly. "Electronic diagnostics are more accurate than manual testing because they eliminate human error and subjective interpretation." Bobby's old techniques might have worked when helicopters were simpler, but modern aircraft require precision that only computer systems can provide. The assertion reflected commonly held beliefs about technological advancement that assumed newer methods were automatically superior to older approaches, regardless of specific circumstances or the nature of problems being addressed. Bobby understood that challenging these assumptions would likely produce defensive responses rather than productive technical discussions, so he maintained his characteristic silence while continuing to observe group dynamics that revealed institutional attitudes toward traditional mechanical expertise. Sergeant Chun contributed additional speculation about Bobby's background and motivations that demonstrated how easily factual information became distorted through casual workplace conversations. "I heard he only took the civilian job because he couldn't keep up with military standards when he was active duty. Probably got forced into retirement because his maintenance techniques were causing more problems than they solved." The fabricated narrative gained credibility through repetition and embellishment, creating a version of Bobby's professional history that bore little resemblance to his actual military service record or the circumstances that had led to his civilian contractor position. Social pressure within military groups often encouraged conformity to prevailing opinions rather than independent evaluation of individual competence or professional qualifications. Bobby's actual military record included commendations for technical innovation and problem-solving abilities that had contributed to mission success under challenging field conditions. But these achievements weren't known to current base personnel, who had access only to his civilian contractor file. The institutional separation between military and civilian personnel created information barriers that prevented accurate assessment of his background and capabilities. The break room conversations continued with increasing speculation about Bobby's role and relevance to contemporary maintenance operations, creating an atmosphere where dismissive attitudes became socially acceptable and professionally reinforced. Rodriguez suggested that civilian contractors were primarily employed for routine tasks that didn't require current technical knowledge, while Walsh expressed doubt about whether traditional diagnostic techniques could produce useful results when applied to sophisticated modern aircraft systems. Chief Warrant Officer Patterson's second attempt to provide historical context met with polite acknowledgement but little genuine consideration from personnel whose training emphasized reliance on electronic systems above alternative troubleshooting approaches. The pilot's experience with aircraft that had been maintained using traditional techniques before computerized diagnostics became standard wasn't valued by mechanics, whose education had focused exclusively on contemporary methods and equipment. Bobby finished his lunch while continuing to listen to conversations that reflected assumptions about age, technology, and professional competence that would influence how his suggestions were received during future technical discussions. The social dynamics of the break room revealed attitudes that extended beyond individual opinions to encompass institutional preferences for modernization and skepticism toward approaches that couldn't be easily categorized within current training frameworks. The afternoon shift brought new personnel into the hangar, including several specialists whose reputations for technical excellence made their opinions particularly influential among maintenance staff. Their arrival provided opportunities for break room conversations to evolve into more formal technical discussions that could either reinforce or challenge prevailing attitudes toward different diagnostic methodologies and professional backgrounds. Specialist Kevin Walsh's workstation became a gathering point for informal consultations as younger technicians sought advice about diagnostic procedures and equipment operation from someone whose recent training made him familiar with the latest electronic systems and troubleshooting protocols. His influence among peers created opportunities for his opinions about traditional versus contemporary approaches to gain wider acceptance among maintenance personnel. The hangar's organizational structure reinforced hierarchical relationships that placed active-duty military personnel above civilian contractors in matters of technical authority and decision-making responsibility. These arrangements reflected legitimate concerns about maintaining proper command structure and accountability, but they also created social dynamics that could prevent valuable expertise from contributing to mission success when circumstances required unconventional approaches to problem solving. Bobby's tool collection became a frequent subject of speculation and occasional humor among military personnel who viewed his manual instruments as evidence of inability to adapt to modern technology rather than recognition of their continued utility for specific diagnostic applications. The social pressure to conform to contemporary standards made it difficult for younger technicians to acknowledge potential benefits of traditional approaches without appearing to challenge institutional preferences for modernization. Staff Sergeant Davidson's leadership style emphasized adherence to established procedures and reliance on electronic diagnostic systems that had been validated through military testing and certification processes. His skepticism toward manual testing techniques reflected legitimate concerns about maintaining technical standards while also revealing institutional bias against approaches that couldn't be easily integrated into contemporary training programs and operational protocols. The organizational culture of military aviation maintenance promoted efficiency through standardization and technology integration, creating an environment where deviations from established procedures required substantial justification and approval from higher authority. These requirements served important safety and quality control functions, but they could also create barriers to implementing solutions that fell outside conventional frameworks but offered potential advantages under specific circumstances. Bobby's civilian contractor status placed him outside the direct military chain of command while still requiring him to work within organizational structures that prioritized military authority and institutional procedures above individual expertise or alternative approaches to technical challenges. This arrangement created opportunities for his knowledge to be overlooked or dismissed when it couldn't be easily categorized within existing frameworks for technical decision-making. The generational differences between Bobby and younger maintenance personnel reflected broader cultural changes in technical education and professional development that emphasize electronic systems and computer-based diagnostic procedures above mechanical understanding and manual testing techniques. These changes produced genuine improvements in efficiency and accuracy for many applications, but they also created knowledge gaps that could become problematic when electronic systems failed or provided inadequate information for effective troubleshooting. During the late afternoon, routine maintenance operations continued throughout the hangar as personnel worked on various aircraft systems using a combination of electronic diagnostic equipment and traditional hand tools that remained necessary for component installation, adjustment, and inspection procedures. The integration of different technological approaches required coordination between specialists whose training backgrounds and preferred methodologies didn't always align seamlessly. Bobby's work assignments typically involved routine tasks that didn't require access to sophisticated diagnostic equipment or decision-making authority about major maintenance procedures. His role was designed to provide supplemental technical support while ensuring that critical decisions remained within military command structure and accountability frameworks that reflected institutional priorities for maintaining proper authority relationships. The afternoon briefing session included updates on aircraft status, maintenance schedules, and operational requirements that would influence work priorities for the following day. Staff Sergeant Davidson reviewed diagnostic results from morning troubleshooting efforts while noting that several aircraft remained unavailable due to unresolved technical issues that had proven resistant to conventional repair approaches. Specialist Walsh's report on the Apache hydraulic problem indicated that electronic diagnostic procedures had continued producing inconsistent results that didn't correlate with any established troubleshooting protocols or component failure patterns documented in technical manuals. His frustration with the situation was evident, but his training provided no alternative approaches for addressing diagnostic challenges that couldn't be resolved through computer-based testing procedures. The briefing concluded with assignments for evening shift personnel who would continue working on aircraft that required extended maintenance attention, while day shift staff prepared to transfer responsibility for ongoing projects to colleagues whose different perspectives and experience levels might contribute to solving problems that had proven challenging during regular work hours. Bobby's evening routine included equipment maintenance and facility cleaning tasks that provided opportunities to observe ongoing maintenance operations, while remaining peripheral to decision-making processes that determined how technical challenges would be addressed. His position allowed him to notice patterns and relationships that might not be apparent to specialists focused on specific diagnostic procedures or component systems. The hangar's lighting systems transitioned from natural daylight supplementation to full artificial illumination as evening approached, creating atmospheric changes that affected both working conditions and social dynamics among personnel, whose shift schedules created different interaction patterns throughout the day. The transition period often provided opportunities for informal conversations between day and evening shift personnel that could influence technical approaches and problem-solving strategies. Bobby's tool maintenance routine included calibration, checks and cleaning procedures that ensured his instruments remained accurate and functional despite their age and the institutional preference for newer equipment. His attention to these details reflected professional standards that had been instilled during military service and reinforced through decades of experience with equipment that required proper care to maintain reliability under field conditions. The evening shift brought Chief Warrant Officer Patterson back to the hangar for routine checks on aircraft that would be scheduled for flight operations during the following day. His pilot perspective provided different insights into aircraft performance and maintenance requirements that could complement the technical knowledge of maintenance specialists, while adding operational considerations to diagnostic decision-making processes. Patterson's interactions with maintenance personnel reflected mutual respect for different types of expertise that contributed to aircraft readiness and mission success. His willingness to consider alternative approaches to technical challenges created opportunities for discussions that might not occur within the more rigid hierarchical structures that characterized routine maintenance operations during regular working hours. The hangar's activity level decreased as evening shift personnel assumed responsibility for ongoing projects, while day shift staff completed their assigned tasks and prepared to transfer accountability for aircraft status to colleagues who would continue maintenance operations throughout the night. These transition periods required careful coordination to ensure that critical information was properly communicated and that work priorities remained aligned with operational requirements. Bobby's position during shift changes provided opportunities to observe how different personnel approached similar technical challenges, revealing patterns in problem-solving strategies and institutional preferences that influenced how diagnostic procedures were selected and implemented. His perspective as someone who had worked with multiple generations of aircraft and maintenance personnel allowed him to recognize relationships between technological approaches and organizational dynamics that might not be apparent to others. The approaching weather system continued developing according to meteorological predictions, creating atmospheric conditions that would soon test the base's aircraft readiness and emergency response capabilities. The storm's timing would determine whether routine maintenance schedules could continue or whether operational priorities would require adjustments to accommodate changing environmental conditions and mission requirements. Captain Thompson's decision came after a moment of silence that seemed to stretch far longer than the actual few seconds it consumed. Her training as a flight operations officer had prepared her for making critical choices under pressure, but authorizing maintenance procedures that deviated from established protocols required accepting responsibility for outcomes that couldn't be predicted through conventional analysis. The lives of 3 wounded soldiers hanging in the balance created urgency that outweighed regulatory concerns about proper certification and standard operating procedures. "Mr. Martinez, you have authorization to proceed with your diagnostic." "Approach," Thompson said, her voice carrying the weight of command decision that would either vindicate unconventional problem-solving or result in mission failure that could cost lives in the field. "Staff Sergeant Davidson will provide any assistance you require, and Specialist Walsh will monitor your procedures to ensure they don't conflict with safety protocols." Bobby nodded acknowledgement while moving toward his tool bag with deliberate efficiency that reflected decades of working under time pressure in situations where systematic methodology was essential for success. His arthritis-stiffened fingers worked quickly through the organized contents of his equipment collection, selecting instruments that he'd maintained and calibrated himself, because their accuracy was crucial for the manual diagnostic procedures he intended to implement. The first tool he retrieved was a mechanical pressure gauge that appeared primitive compared to the electronic monitoring systems that dominated contemporary aircraft maintenance, but its analog display could provide direct readings of hydraulic system performance without relying on computer interpretation of sensor data that might be influenced by factors the electronic systems couldn't properly evaluate. The gauge's brass fittings and steel construction reflected manufacturing standards from an era when instruments were built to withstand harsh field conditions and provide reliable service without electronic support systems. Staff Sergeant Davidson's expression revealed internal conflict between his responsibility to support authorized maintenance procedures and his personal skepticism about traditional diagnostic approaches that seemed inconsistent with contemporary technical standards. His cooperation would be essential for accessing aircraft systems and coordinating safety procedures, but his body language suggested reluctance to participate in methods that challenged his training and institutional preferences. Bobby's approach to the Apache began with external visual inspection that focused on hydraulic system components, visible through access panels and inspection ports that provided limited views of internal mechanisms. His examination involved looking for signs of fluid leakage, component wear, and mechanical damage that electronic diagnostic systems couldn't detect because they monitored performance parameters rather than physical condition of individual parts. The aircraft's hydraulic architecture included multiple pumps, reservoirs, filters, and control valves that worked together to provide the precise pressure and flow characteristics required for flight control systems, landing gear operation, and weapon system articulation. Bobby's knowledge of these relationships came from years of troubleshooting similar systems, when diagnostic computers weren't available to provide guidance about component interactions and failure modes. Specialist Walsh positioned himself where he could observe Bobby's procedures while maintaining access to his diagnostic computer in case electronic monitoring became necessary to verify results or identify safety concerns. His skepticism remained evident, but professional curiosity about traditional techniques that he'd never learned created interest in observing methods that his training had dismissed as obsolete without providing opportunities to understand their potential applications. Bobby's initial inspection revealed hydraulic fluid stains around several fittings that suggested minor leakage issues, but nothing that would account for the pressure irregularities and system response problems that had been detected by electronic diagnostic procedures. The visible evidence indicated routine maintenance concerns rather than major component failures that would prevent aircraft operation, creating discrepancy between physical observations and computer-generated fault codes. The first manual test involved installing Bobby's mechanical pressure gauge at a test port that provided direct access to the primary hydraulic circuit, bypassing electronic sensors and monitoring systems that might be providing misleading information due to calibration errors or component degradation. His gauge required manual connection procedures that involved understanding hydraulic system architecture and component relationships rather than simply following computer-generated instructions. The pressure reading on Bobby's analog gauge differed significantly from the values displayed on Walsh's electronic monitoring system, suggesting that sensor calibration issues or electronic interference were causing the computer diagnostic procedures to misinterpret actual hydraulic system performance. The discrepancy provided the first concrete evidence that traditional testing methods could reveal information that sophisticated electronic systems were missing due to their reliance on potentially inaccurate sensor data. Staff Sergeant Davidson observed the pressure measurement procedure with growing interest as the implications of the reading differences became apparent. His technical training included theoretical understanding of sensor calibration issues, but practical experience with manual testing procedures was limited because contemporary maintenance protocols emphasized electronic diagnostic systems above alternative verification methods. Bobby's explanation of the pressure measurement results included details about hydraulic system dynamics and component relationships that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of aircraft engineering principles that remained valid regardless of electronic monitoring capabilities or computer-assisted diagnostic procedures. His analysis revealed how sensor drift and electronic interference could cause diagnostic systems to report problems that didn't actually exist while missing genuine issues that required mechanical inspection and testing. The second phase of Bobby's diagnostic approach involved testing hydraulic system response characteristics using manual control inputs that could reveal performance problems, invisible to electronic monitoring systems that measured steady state parameters rather than dynamic response patterns. His procedure required coordinating control inputs with pressure measurements to identify component interactions that might be causing the intermittent problems reported by computer diagnostic systems. Specialist Walsh's electronic diagnostic equipment continued displaying fault codes that appeared and disappeared without correlation to Bobby's manual testing procedures, confirming that the computer systems were responding to factors that weren't related to actual hydraulic system performance. The electronic diagnostic confusion had prevented conventional troubleshooting from identifying the real source of aircraft problems that were preventing mission-critical operations. Bobby's manual testing revealed that hydraulic system performance was actually within acceptable limits for flight operations, but electronic sensor calibration errors were causing diagnostic computers to interpret normal operating parameters as fault conditions. The problem wasn't mechanical failure requiring component replacement, but rather electronic system issues that could be corrected through sensor recalibration and monitoring system adjustments. The diagnostic revelation transformed the maintenance challenge from complex component replacement requiring hours of work to electronic system adjustment that could be completed within the remaining time constraints imposed by weather conditions and medical emergency requirements. Bobby's traditional approach had identified problems that sophisticated computer systems couldn't isolate because they were experiencing the very sensor issues that were causing the diagnostic confusion. Captain Thompson monitored the diagnostic progress while coordinating with Tactical Operations Center about mission planning and weather updates that continued confirming the narrow window available for helicopter operations before storm conditions made flight impossible. The successful identification of hydraulic system problems created opportunities for rapid resolution that could enable the medical evacuation mission to proceed as originally planned. Bobby's sensor recalibration procedures involved manual adjustment techniques that he'd learned during military service when electronic diagnostic systems required periodic calibration to maintain accuracy under field conditions. His knowledge of calibration procedures that weren't covered in contemporary training programs reflected institutional memory about aircraft maintenance practices that had been largely forgotten as computer systems became more sophisticated and seemingly self-maintaining. Staff Sergeant Davidson assisted with sensor access and adjustment procedures that required coordination between manual calibration techniques and electronic system monitoring to ensure that changes produce desired improvements in diagnostic accuracy. His participation in the calibration process provided learning opportunities about traditional maintenance practices that complemented his contemporary technical training while demonstrating practical applications for manual procedures. The calibration process required approximately 15 minutes of careful adjustment and verification testing using Bobby's mechanical instruments to confirm that electronic sensors were providing accurate readings that corresponded to actual hydraulic system performance characteristics. His systematic approach ensured that each sensor was properly calibrated before proceeding to the next component, preventing the accumulation of small errors that could cause significant diagnostic problems. Specialist Walsh observed the calibration procedures with growing amazement as his electronic diagnostic system began displaying consistent and logical fault codes that correlated with actual aircraft conditions rather than the confusing and contradictory information that had been preventing effective troubleshooting. The transformation of diagnostic data from chaos to clarity demonstrated the value of traditional calibration techniques that his training had never emphasized. The final verification testing involved running complete hydraulic system checks, using both manual pressure measurements and electronic monitoring to confirm that all parameters were within acceptable limits for flight operations. Bobby's mechanical gauges provided reference standards for evaluating electronic system accuracy while ensuring that the Apache's hydraulic systems were functioning properly for mission requirements. Captain Thompson received confirmation that the Apache was ready for modification and medical evacuation. Mission preparation with 14 minutes remaining before weather conditions would prevent helicopter operations entirely. The successful diagnostic resolution had created sufficient time for installing medical equipment and completing pre-flight checks that were necessary for launching the life-saving mission to evacuate wounded soldiers from the field. The transformation of attitudes toward Bobby's expertise became apparent as military personnel who had previously dismissed his traditional approaches now sought his guidance about manual testing procedures and calibration techniques that could supplement electronic diagnostic capabilities. Staff Sergeant Davidson requested information about acquiring similar mechanical instruments for future troubleshooting situations where electronic systems might provide unreliable information. Specialist Walsh documented the sensor calibration procedures that Bobby had implemented, recognizing that traditional techniques could provide valuable backup capabilities when sophisticated computer systems experienced problems that prevented effective diagnosis and repair of aircraft systems. His notes would contribute to training programs that could integrate manual testing methods with contemporary electronic diagnostic procedures. The medical equipment installation proceeded rapidly as maintenance personnel worked with renewed confidence in the Apache's hydraulic system reliability, knowing that Bobby's diagnostic approach had identified and corrected the electronic sensor issues that had been preventing accurate assessment of aircraft readiness. The successful resolution of technical problems created opportunities for mission success that had seemed impossible when conventional troubleshooting failed to produce useful results. Chief Warrant Officer Patterson arrived for pre-flight inspection and mission briefing as the Apache modification neared completion, bringing pilot expertise that would ensure aircraft systems were properly configured for the challenging medical evacuation operation under deteriorating weather conditions. His coordination with maintenance personnel reflected the teamwork necessary for mission success when time constraints eliminated opportunities for extended preparation and testing. The weather monitoring station provided final updates confirming that the storm system was approaching on schedule, creating a narrow launch window that would require precise timing and coordination between maintenance completion, pilot preparation, and tactical operations center guidance for navigating to the evacuation site and returning safely before atmospheric conditions became prohibitive for helicopter operations. Bobby's role in the mission success extended beyond diagnostic problem solving to include ongoing technical support during aircraft preparation and pre-flight checks that ensured all systems were functioning properly for the demanding operational requirements. His expertise provided confidence for pilots and mission planners who needed assurance that aircraft reliability wouldn't compromise mission safety or effectiveness during critical operations. The hangar buzzed with coordinated activity as multiple teams worked simultaneously on different aspects of mission preparation, from medical equipment installation to flight planning and weather monitoring that would determine the precise timing for launch and recovery operations. Bobby's diagnostic success had created the foundation for teamwork that transformed potential mission failure into organized effort toward saving lives under challenging conditions. The Apache's engine spooled up for final systems checks as Bobby completed his documentation of diagnostic procedures and sensor calibration, results that would be valuable for future maintenance operations and training programs. His systematic approach to problem solving had produced not only immediate mission success but also institutional knowledge that could benefit other aircraft and maintenance situations, requiring similar troubleshooting approaches. Captain Thompson's mission authorization came through tactical communications as weather monitoring confirmed that launch conditions remained acceptable for helicopter operations, creating the final approval needed for the medical evacuation mission that would test both aircraft performance and crew capabilities under demanding operational circumstances. The successful resolution of maintenance challenges had enabled mission planning that could save lives through coordinated effort and technical expertise. The Apache lifted off from Fort Carson with medical equipment and crew prepared for the challenging evacuation operation that required navigating through deteriorating weather conditions to reach wounded soldiers whose survival depended on rapid medical intervention that only helicopter evacuation could provide within the critical time frame imposed by their injuries and the approaching storm system. Bobby watched from the hangar as the helicopter disappeared into the darkening sky, knowing that his diagnostic expertise had contributed to mission success that would save lives through the application of traditional maintenance techniques that contemporary training programs had largely forgotten. His arthritis-stiffened hands felt the satisfaction of solving problems that sophisticated computer systems couldn't address through conventional troubleshooting approaches. The mission's successful outcome was confirmed 3 hours later when the Apache returned to Fort Carson with 3 wounded soldiers who received immediate medical attention from trauma specialists, whose surgical capabilities had been made available through helicopter evacuation that wouldn't have been possible without resolving the aircraft maintenance challenges that had initially prevented mission authorization and launch operations. Staff Sergeant Davidson approached Bobby during the post-mission debriefing to express appreciation for diagnostic expertise that had enabled mission success while providing learning opportunities about traditional maintenance techniques that could supplement contemporary electronic diagnostic procedures. His recognition reflected changing attitudes toward the value of institutional memory and manual testing approaches that could address problems beyond the capabilities of computer-based troubleshooting systems. The mission success story spread throughout Fort Carson as word of Bobby's diagnostic achievement reached personnel who had previously dismissed his traditional approaches as obsolete methods unsuitable for contemporary aircraft maintenance requirements. The successful application of manual testing techniques under emergency conditions demonstrated that technological advancement didn't eliminate the value of fundamental mechanical knowledge and systematic problem-solving approaches. Chief Warrant Officer Patterson included Bobby's diagnostic contribution in his mission report, citing the civilian contractor's expertise as essential for aircraft readiness that enabled life-saving medical evacuation operations under challenging conditions. The official recognition provided documentation of traditional maintenance value that could influence future training programs, and institutional approaches to integrating different diagnostic methodologies. The following week brought requests from other military installations for information about manual diagnostic procedures and traditional calibration techniques that could provide backup capabilities when electronic systems experienced problems, preventing effective aircraft maintenance and troubleshooting operations. Bobby's expertise had created institutional interest in preserving and teaching mechanical knowledge that complemented contemporary computer-based diagnostic approaches. Specialist Walsh requested additional training in manual testing procedures and mechanical instrument operation, recognizing that traditional techniques could provide valuable capabilities for addressing diagnostic challenges that electronic systems couldn't resolve effectively. His interest reflected broader recognition among younger personnel that technological advancement should supplement rather than replace fundamental mechanical understanding and manual testing capabilities. The Apache incident became a case study in military maintenance training programs that emphasized the importance of preserving institutional knowledge and traditional techniques that could provide solutions when contemporary approaches proved inadequate for specific technical challenges. Bobby's diagnostic success demonstrated that expertise developed through decades of practical experience remained valuable despite technological changes that seemed to make older methods obsolete. Bobby's reputation throughout Fort Carson evolved from dismissed civilian contractor to recognized technical expert whose traditional diagnostic approaches could address problems that sophisticated electronic systems couldn't resolve through conventional troubleshooting procedures. The transformation reflected changing appreciation for institutional memory and mechanical knowledge that complemented contemporary training and technological capabilities. The long-term impact of Bobby's diagnostic success extended beyond individual recognition to influence military policies about preserving traditional maintenance knowledge and integrating manual testing techniques with contemporary electronic diagnostic procedures. His expertise had demonstrated that technological advancement should preserve rather than eliminate valuable approaches that could provide solutions under specific circumstances requiring unconventional problem-solving methods. Years later, when young maintenance technicians at Fort Carson encountered diagnostic challenges that electronic systems couldn't resolve effectively, their supervisors would mention the civilian contractor whose traditional approaches had saved lives by solving problems that sophisticated computer diagnostic procedures had failed to identify and correct. Bobby's legacy lived in the training programs that now included manual testing techniques and the recognition that expertise developed through practical experience remained valuable regardless of technological advancement. The story of the maintenance man who fixed the Apache helicopter in 30 minutes became more than just an account of technical problem-solving under pressure. It represented proof that institutional knowledge, traditional techniques, and systematic mechanical understanding could provide solutions when contemporary approaches proved inadequate for addressing specific challenges that required unconventional diagnostic methods and the courage to trust expertise that didn't conform to prevailing technological preferences. Bobby continued his work at Fort Carson with quiet satisfaction, knowing that his traditional diagnostic approaches had proven their continued value while contributing to mission success that saved lives through the application of mechanical knowledge and manual testing techniques that younger personnel were now learning to appreciate and implement. His arthritis-stiffened hands remained capable of solving problems that sophisticated computer systems couldn't address, demonstrating that expertise developed through decades of practical experience retained its value regardless of technological changes that seemed to make older methods obsolete. The Hangar's daily operations continued with renewed appreciation for the integration of traditional and contemporary diagnostic approaches, while Bobby's tool bag remained ready for future challenges that might require manual testing techniques. and mechanical knowledge that complemented rather than competed with electronic diagnostic capabilities. His success had demonstrated that the most effective problem-solving often combined multiple methodologies rather than relying exclusively on any single approach. Regardless of its sophistication or technological advancement, the crimson alert lights began flashing throughout Hangar 7 at precisely 14:23 hours, their urgent strobing pattern cutting through the afternoon routine like a blade through silence. The base-wide emergency notification system crackled to life with mechanical precision, broadcasting the priority message that would transform Bobby Martinez from overlooked civilian contractor to the pivotal figure in a life-or-death race against time and weather. Emergency medical evacuation required immediate helicopter deployment to grid reference 41SU B14507-823, where 3 critically wounded soldiers from Alpha Company's reconnaissance patrol lay bleeding in hostile territory after their vehicle had struck an improvised explosive device during a routine security sweep. The tactical situation report painted a grim picture of injuries that included severe trauma, arterial bleeding, and potential internal damage that required immediate surgical intervention at the base's Level 1 trauma center to prevent casualties that could be avoided with rapid medical response. Captain Thompson's voice carried across the hangar's communication system as she coordinated the emergency response with Tactical Operations Center, her professional composure masking the urgency that drove every decision in situations where minutes could determine whether soldiers returned home to their families or became statistics in casualty reports. The medical evacuation timeline allowed exactly 97 minutes for aircraft preparation, flight to the casualty site, patient loading, and return to Fort Carson before deteriorating weather conditions would ground all helicopter operations indefinitely. The meteorological report confirmed what everyone could see through the hangars. Massive doors as towering cumulus clouds built rapidly along the western horizon, their dark gray masses promising severe turbulence, driving rain and wind conditions that would make helicopter operations impossible once the storm system reached the base's operational area. Weather reconnaissance aircraft reported surface winds already gusting to 35 knots at the casualty site, with conditions expected to exceed safe flight parameters within 2 hours as the storm's leading edge swept across the mountainous terrain. Staff Sergeant Davidson's rapid assessment of available aircraft revealed the tactical nightmare that had been developing throughout the afternoon as routine maintenance schedules coincided with the emergency requirement for immediate helicopter deployment. The primary medical evacuation aircraft remained committed to a training exercise that couldn't be recalled in time to meet operational deadlines, while backup helicopters were undergoing scheduled maintenance procedures that left their critical systems partially disassembled and hours away from operational readiness. The situation's cruel irony became apparent as Davidson's status report confirmed that Fort Carson possessed multiple helicopter platforms capable of performing medical evacuation missions, but bureaucratic scheduling and maintenance timing had created a perfect storm of unavailability that threatened to prevent any response to the emergency situation developing in the field. Standard military planning protocols included redundancy and backup systems, specifically designed to prevent such scenarios, but the convergence of routine operations and emergency requirements had exposed vulnerabilities that training scenarios rarely addressed. Apache helicopter tail number 0703847 represented the installation's last viable option for rapid deployment, its Guardian variant configuration providing advanced flight systems and performance capabilities that could handle the challenging weather conditions expected during the mission timeline. However, the aircraft's sophisticated electronic systems had been generating diagnostic fault codes for the past 6 hours, creating maintenance complications that had prevented clearance for flight operations, despite the absence of obvious mechanical problems. Specialist Walsh's frustration was evident as he explained to Captain Thompson that his electronic diagnostic procedures had failed to isolate the source of hydraulic system anomalies that appeared on computer displays but couldn't be correlated with specific component failures or maintenance requirements. The fault code suggested multiple problems occurring simultaneously, a pattern that didn't match any troubleshooting scenarios covered in technical manuals or training programs that emphasized computer-guided diagnostic procedures. The Apache's electronic diagnostic system continued displaying cascading fault warnings that included primary hydraulic pressure irregularities, secondary system response delays, and tertiary circuit anomalies that collectively prevented the aircraft from receiving clearance for flight operations. Walsh's attempts to isolate individual problems using standard troubleshooting procedures had produced contradictory results, with fault codes appearing and disappearing without correlation to any specific maintenance actions or component testing procedures. Chief Warrant Officer Patterson's pilot perspective added operational urgency to the technical discussions, as he emphasized the narrow weather window available for completing the medical evacuation mission before atmospheric conditions eliminated all flight options. His experience with Apache operations under challenging conditions provided insight into aircraft performance requirements that would be necessary for navigating through deteriorating weather while carrying wounded personnel who couldn't tolerate excessive turbulence or extended flight times. The Tactical Operations Center provided regular updates on the wounded soldiers' conditions, painting an increasingly desperate medical picture that emphasized the critical importance of rapid helicopter evacuation to prevent casualties that could be avoided with timely intervention. Field medics reported that 2 soldiers required immediate surgical attention for arterial trauma, while the third had sustained internal injuries that could become fatal without advanced medical care that was only available at the base's trauma center. Bobby had been monitoring the emergency response from his workstation while continuing routine maintenance tasks on adjacent aircraft, his decades of experience allowing him to recognize the developing crisis that sophisticated diagnostic procedures were failing to resolve effectively. The pattern of electronic fault codes that had confused younger technicians matched symptoms he'd encountered during his military service when sensor calibration issues created diagnostic confusion that prevented accurate assessment of aircraft system performance. The hydraulic anomalies being reported by the Apache's electronic monitoring systems showed characteristics that Bobby recognized from previous experience with sensor drift and electronic interference that could cause computer diagnostic procedures to misinterpret normal operating parameters as system failures. His knowledge of these issues came from years of working on aircraft when manual testing procedures were necessary for verifying electronic diagnostic results and ensuring that computer-generated fault codes accurately reflected actual system conditions. Staff Sergeant Davidson's increasingly frustrated attempts to coordinate diagnostic procedures with mission timeline requirements created visible tension as technical challenges threatened to prevent the evacuation mission that could save lives through rapid medical intervention. His responsibility for aircraft readiness conflicted with safety protocols that prohibited flight operations when diagnostic systems indicated potential hydraulic problems, regardless of whether those problems represented genuine mechanical failures or electronic monitoring issues. The hangar's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as personnel struggled with diagnostic procedures that weren't producing useful results while time constraints, imposed by weather conditions and medical emergencies, eliminated opportunities for extended troubleshooting or consultation with technical specialists from other installations. The convergence of multiple crisis factors had created a situation that required immediate solutions using available resources and expertise rather than standard procedures that assumed adequate time for systematic analysis. Captain Thompson faced the impossible choice between authorizing flight operations with an aircraft that showed electronic fault indications, or accepting responsibility for preventable casualties that would result from inability to launch medical evacuation operations within the critical time frame. Her decision would be scrutinized by military investigators regardless of the outcome, making her position extraordinarily difficult as operational requirements conflicted with safety protocols designed to prevent aircraft accidents. Bobby's recognition of the diagnostic patterns that were preventing mission authorization led him to approach the group of military personnel who had been struggling with electronic troubleshooting procedures for nearly 2 hours without producing effective solutions. His civilian contractor status made intervention delicate, but his technical knowledge of the specific problems being encountered provided potential solutions that conventional diagnostic approaches couldn't address within the remaining time constraints. The moment when Bobby stepped forward to offer his expertise represented a convergence of institutional barriers, technical challenges, and life or death urgency that would test whether traditional mechanical knowledge could contribute to mission success when contemporary electronic systems failed to provide adequate guidance for critical decision-making. His intervention required courage because it involved contradicting the conclusions of military specialists whose authority was officially recognized, while his suggestions were based on manual diagnostic techniques that official procedures no longer emphasized. Captain Thompson's willingness to consider Bobby's input reflected desperation, born of failed conventional approaches and the recognition that unconventional solutions might represent the only remaining option for enabling the medical evacuation mission. Her decision to authorize diagnostic procedures that deviated from standard protocols required accepting personal responsibility for outcomes that couldn't be predicted through established analysis frameworks or institutional guidelines. Bobby's systematic approach to the hydraulic diagnostic challenge began with manual pressure measurements that bypassed electronic sensors entirely, using mechanical instruments that provided direct readings of actual system performance rather than computer interpretations that might be influenced by calibration errors or electronic interference. His testing procedures involved techniques that he'd learned during military service when manual verification was necessary for confirming electronic diagnostic results. The first manual pressure reading revealed significant discrepancies between actual hydraulic system performance and the values being reported by electronic monitoring systems, confirming Bobby's suspicions that sensor calibration issues were causing diagnostic computers to misinterpret normal operating parameters as fault conditions. The discovery provided immediate evidence that the Apache's hydraulic systems were functioning within acceptable limits, despite electronic indications suggesting multiple component failures. Specialist Walsh observed Bobby's manual testing procedures with growing amazement as traditional diagnostic techniques revealed information that sophisticated computer systems had been unable to provide. Through hours of electronic troubleshooting, the mechanical pressure gauges showed consistent readings that indicated normal hydraulic system operation, contradicting the cascading fault codes that had been preventing aircraft clearance for flight operations. Staff Sergeant Davidson's participation in the manual diagnostic process reflected his recognition that conventional electronic procedures had failed to produce useful results within the time constraints imposed by the emergency situation. His assistance with Bobby's testing techniques provided opportunities for learning about traditional diagnostic approaches that could supplement contemporary computer-based troubleshooting when electronic systems experienced calibration problems or interference issues. The systematic sensor recalibration process that Bobby implemented required approximately 25 minutes of careful adjustment and verification testing, during which time weather monitoring stations continued reporting deteriorating atmospheric conditions that were approaching the limits for safe helicopter operations. Each sensor required individual attention to ensure proper calibration, while electronic diagnostic systems needed time to process the adjusted parameters and update their fault code displays accordingly. Bobby's manual calibration techniques involved procedures that he'd learned during an era when electronic diagnostic systems required regular adjustment to maintain accuracy under field conditions. His knowledge of calibration processes that weren't covered in contemporary training programs reflected institutional memory about aircraft maintenance practices that had been largely forgotten as computer systems became more sophisticated and seemingly self-maintaining. The transformation of electronic diagnostic results from chaos to clarity provided dramatic confirmation of Bobby's technical analysis as fault codes disappeared and system parameters stabilized within normal operating ranges. Specialist Walsh's monitoring equipment began displaying consistent and logical information that correlated with actual aircraft conditions, rather than the confusing and contradictory data that had been preventing effective troubleshooting throughout the afternoon. Captain Thompson received confirmation that the Apache was cleared for flight operations with 38 minutes remaining before weather conditions would prevent helicopter operations entirely. The successful resolution of diagnostic problems had created sufficient time for medical equipment, installation and pre-flight procedures that were necessary for launching the evacuation mission that could save 3 lives through rapid medical intervention. The medical equipment modification process proceeded with remarkable efficiency as maintenance personnel worked with renewed confidence in the aircraft's system reliability, knowing that Bobby's diagnostic expertise had identified and corrected the electronic monitoring issues that had been preventing accurate assessment of hydraulic system performance. The successful resolution of technical challenges enabled focused effort on mission preparation rather than continued troubleshooting of problems that had proven resistant to conventional diagnostic approaches. Chief Warrant Officer Patterson completed his pre-flight inspection and crew briefing as the Apache modification neared completion, coordinating with medical personnel who would accompany the mission to provide advanced life support during flight operations. The successful diagnostic resolution had enabled mission planning that integrated aircraft capabilities with medical requirements and weather constraints to maximize the probability of successful evacuation within the narrow operational window. The weather monitoring station provided final atmospheric updates that confirmed storm system arrival within 45 minutes, creating precise timing requirements for mission launch and recovery operations that would test both aircraft performance and crew capabilities under challenging environmental conditions. Bobby's diagnostic success had created the foundation for mission authorization that transformed potential failure into organized effort toward saving lives. The Apache's engines reached operational temperature as Bobby completed his documentation of diagnostic procedures and sensor calibration results, ensuring that future maintenance operations would benefit from knowledge gained during the emergency troubleshooting process. His systematic approach had produced not only immediate mission enablement, but also institutional learning that could prevent similar diagnostic confusion during future aircraft maintenance operations. Captain Thompson's final mission authorization came through tactical communications as weather monitoring confirmed acceptable launch conditions for helicopter operations, providing the approval needed for medical evacuation that would test aircraft systems and crew performance under demanding operational circumstances. The successful resolution of maintenance challenges had enabled coordinated effort that could save lives through technical expertise and traditional diagnostic knowledge. The helicopter lifted off from Fort Carson, carrying medical equipment and personnel, prepared for the challenging evacuation operation that required navigating through deteriorating weather conditions to reach wounded soldiers whose survival depended on rapid intervention that only helicopter evacuation could provide within the critical medical timeframe. Bobby watched from the hangar as the aircraft disappeared into darkening skies, knowing that his expertise had contributed to mission success. Through application of traditional maintenance techniques, The mission's successful outcome was confirmed when the Apache returned to Fort Carson with 3 wounded soldiers who received immediate trauma care from military surgeons whose capabilities had been made available through helicopter evacuation. That wouldn't have been possible without resolving the diagnostic challenges that had initially prevented mission authorization. The lives saved through Bobby's technical intervention provided tangible validation of traditional diagnostic value in contemporary military operations. The transformation of institutional attitudes toward Bobby's expertise became apparent as military personnel throughout Fort Carson learned about the civilian contractor whose traditional diagnostic approaches had enabled life-saving medical evacuation when sophisticated electronic systems failed to provide adequate troubleshooting guidance. His success challenged assumptions about technological advancement and the relative value of different maintenance methodologies. Staff Sergeant Davidson's post-mission recognition of Bobby's contribution included requests for additional training in manual diagnostic procedures that could supplement electronic troubleshooting capabilities during future maintenance challenges. His changed perspective reflected broader institutional recognition that traditional techniques retained value, despite technological advancement that seemed to make older methods obsolete. The Apache incident became a catalyst for military maintenance training program modifications that emphasized preserving institutional knowledge and integrating traditional diagnostic techniques with contemporary electronic procedures. Bobby's success demonstrated that expertise developed through practical experience remained valuable for addressing specific technical challenges that computer-based systems couldn't resolve effectively. Specialist Walsh documented Bobby's sensor calibration procedures for inclusion in training materials that would teach younger personnel about manual testing techniques and mechanical instrument operation. His recognition that traditional approaches could provide essential backup capabilities when electronic systems experienced problems reflected evolving appreciation for institutional memory and fundamental mechanical knowledge. The long-term impact of Bobby's diagnostic achievement extended beyond individual recognition to influence military policies about maintaining traditional maintenance capabilities alongside contemporary technological systems. His expertise had proven that effective problem-solving often required combining multiple methodologies rather than relying exclusively on electronic diagnostic procedures, regardless of their sophistication. Chief Warrant Officer Patterson's mission report cited Bobby's contribution as essential for aircraft readiness that enabled successful medical evacuation under emergency conditions, providing official documentation of civilian contractor value that could influence future training programs and institutional approaches to technical problem solving. The recognition established precedent for integrating traditional expertise with contemporary procedures. Years later, when maintenance personnel at military installations encountered diagnostic challenges that electronic systems couldn't resolve, their supervisors referenced the Fort Carson incident where traditional techniques had saved lives by solving problems that sophisticated computer procedures couldn't identify or correct. Bobby's legacy influenced training programs that now included manual diagnostic methods alongside electronic troubleshooting capabilities. The story of the maintenance man who enabled Apache helicopter operations in 30 minutes became institutional memory that demonstrated the continued value of traditional expertise in contemporary military operations. Bobby's success proved that systematic mechanical knowledge and manual testing techniques could provide solutions when modern approaches proved inadequate for specific technical challenges requiring unconventional diagnostic methods. Bobby continued his work at Fort Carson with quiet satisfaction, maintaining his traditional diagnostic capabilities while contributing to mission success through expertise that younger personnel were learning to value and implement. His tool bag remained ready for future challenges that might require manual testing techniques and mechanical knowledge that complemented electronic diagnostic systems. The hangar's daily operations evolved to include greater appreciation for integrating traditional and contemporary maintenance approaches. While Bobby's experience demonstrated that the most effective technical solutions often combine multiple methodologies rather than depending exclusively on any single diagnostic approach, his success had proven that preparation, experience, and institutional memory retained their value regardless of technological advancement. The maintenance bay where Bobby had performed his diagnostic breakthrough became an unofficial training location where experienced personnel shared traditional techniques with younger staff, ensuring that institutional knowledge would continue serving military operations through future generations of technicians and aircraft systems. His legacy lived in the recognition that expertise transcended technological preferences and generational differences. The months following the emergency medical evacuation brought subtle but significant changes to the daily rhythms of Hangar. 7. Transformations that rippled through Fort Carson's aviation community in ways that reflected a fundamental shift in how institutional knowledge was valued and preserved. Bobby Martinez continued arriving at exactly 0630 hours each weekday morning, his familiar gait and weathered tool bag unchanged, but the reception he encountered from military personnel had evolved dramatically from casual dismissal to genuine respect for expertise that had proven its worth under the most demanding circumstances. The hangar's break room conversations now included Bobby as a regular participant rather than someone to be discussed in his absence, with younger technicians actively seeking his perspectives on diagnostic challenges and maintenance procedures that went beyond their formal training requirements. Specialist Walsh had become particularly interested in learning manual testing techniques, recognizing that traditional approaches could provide essential capabilities when electronic systems experienced the kind of problems that had nearly prevented the life-saving evacuation mission. Staff Sergeant Davidson's leadership style incorporated Bobby's expertise into routine maintenance planning, consulting with a civilian contractor about aircraft systems and troubleshooting, approaches that could supplement standard diagnostic procedures. The sergeant's initial skepticism had transformed into appreciation for institutional memory that complemented contemporary training, while providing backup capabilities for situations where computer-based systems might prove inadequate. For effective problem-solving, the Apache helicopter that Bobby had restored to operational status became something of a legend within Fort Carson's aviation community, its successful mission serving as tangible proof that traditional maintenance knowledge retained practical value in contemporary military operations. Maintenance logs for tail number 0703847 now included detailed documentation of sensor calibration procedures and manual testing techniques that Bobby had implemented, creating permanent records that would guide future troubleshooting efforts. Training programs throughout the installation began incorporating elements of Bobby's diagnostic approach, with formal instruction in manual testing procedures and mechanical instrument operation becoming standard components of advanced maintenance curricula. The integration of traditional techniques with contemporary electronic diagnostic capabilities reflected institutional recognition that effective problem-solving often required multiple methodological approaches rather than exclusive dependence on sophisticated computer systems. Chief Warrant Officer Patterson's advocacy for preserving traditional maintenance knowledge had gained support from senior leadership who recognized the operational value demonstrated during the emergency evacuation mission. His recommendations for maintaining institutional expertise alongside technological advancement influenced policy discussions about training requirements and professional development programs that would ensure critical knowledge remained available for future operational needs. The 3 soldiers whose lives had been saved through the successful medical evacuation made full recoveries, returning to active duty with renewed appreciation for the complex support systems that enabled military operations. Their family sent letters of gratitude to Fort Carson personnel, including specific recognition of the maintenance expertise that had made their loved ones' rescue possible when sophisticated diagnostic systems had failed to provide adequate guidance for mission authorization. Bobby's reputation extended beyond Fort Carson as other military installations requested information about traditional diagnostic procedures and manual testing techniques that could supplement electronic troubleshooting capabilities. His expertise became the foundation for inter-base training exchanges and technical consultation programs that shared institutional knowledge across the broader military aviation community. The transformation of attitudes toward civilian contractors reflected broader recognition that expertise transcended organizational boundaries and formal hierarchies, with practical knowledge and systematic problem-solving abilities proving more valuable than credentials or institutional status during crisis situations requiring unconventional solutions. Bobby's success had demonstrated that effective technical support could come from unexpected sources when circumstances demanded innovative approaches to challenging problems. Advanced maintenance training facilities began displaying Bobby's mechanical instruments alongside contemporary electronic diagnostic equipment, using his tools as examples of traditional technology that remained relevant for specific applications despite technological advancement that seemed to make older methods obsolete. The integration symbolized institutional commitment to preserving valuable knowledge while embracing modern capabilities that enhanced overall maintenance effectiveness. Weather monitoring systems at Fort Carson continued providing the precise atmospheric data that had made Bobby's diagnostic timeline so critical during the emergency evacuation mission, serving as constant reminders of how narrow operational windows could determine mission success or failure. The meteorological factors that had created urgency during the Apache repair had become part of institutional memory about the importance of rapid problem-solving capabilities under challenging conditions. The civilian contractor program at Fort Carson evolved to include greater recognition of expertise that civilian personnel brought to military operations, with Bobby's success serving as a model for integrating traditional knowledge with contemporary organizational structures. His achievement had proven that effective technical support required valuing experience and systematic knowledge, regardless of their sources or their alignment with prevailing institutional preferences. Documentation of Bobby's diagnostic procedures became standard reference material for maintenance training programs, providing detailed guidance about manual testing techniques and sensor calibration processes that could address problems beyond the capabilities of electronic diagnostic systems. His methodical approach to problem solving had created educational resources that would benefit future generations of military maintenance personnel. The legacy of the Apache helicopter incident extended far beyond Fort Carson as military maintenance. Communities throughout the defense establishment incorporated lessons learned from Bobby's success into their own training programs and operational procedures. His demonstration that traditional techniques could solve problems that sophisticated computer systems couldn't address had influenced institutional thinking about the relationship between technological advancement and practical expertise. Bobby's quiet satisfaction with these developments reflected his characteristic focus on practical outcomes rather than personal recognition, viewing the institutional changes as validation of systematic approaches to technical challenges rather than individual achievement requiring celebration. His continued presence in Hangar 7 provided ongoing opportunities for knowledge transfer and mentorship that ensured traditional diagnostic capabilities would remain available for future operational requirements. The tool bag that had once marked Bobby as someone whose methods belonged to an earlier era of aircraft maintenance now represented institutional memory and practical expertise that complemented rather than competed with contemporary technological capabilities. His mechanical instruments had become symbols of the value that systematic knowledge and methodical problem-solving could provide when Circumstances required solutions beyond the scope of standard procedures. Fort Carson's aviation maintenance operations had been fundamentally strengthened through recognition that effective technical support required integrating multiple approaches to diagnostic challenges rather than depending exclusively on any single methodology, regardless of its sophistication or institutional preference. Bobby's success had proven that the most reliable solutions often combined traditional knowledge with contemporary capabilities, creating comprehensive problem-solving resources that could address a broader range of technical challenges than either approach could handle independently. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.